Snow fell in slow, deliberate sheets over Kummersdorf, blanketing the German proving grounds in a white, deathly silence. The air was sharp, filled with the smell of cold metal, oil, and distant pine. Inside a vast hangar, a captured American M4 Sherman stood in the center of the floor, its olive-green paint dulled by frost. Around it gathered a small group of German engineers, men who had spent years building Panthers and Tigers, machines they believed were the peak of engineering perfection. To them, this foreign tank was crude, inelegant, and absurdly simple. They found amusement in its design, even contempt. They were there to test its engine, the American-made heart of a tank that had overwhelmed their divisions in North Africa and France. Reports said it was reliable, that it ran in the desert, in rain, and even through snow. Such claims insulted German sensibilities. Precision was supposed to belong to them, not to factories in Detroit. The idea that a mass-produced American machine could endure what their finely tuned engines could not was inconceivable. The tests were methodical. The engineers drained and refilled fuel lines, measured viscosity, and installed their own standard batteries for fairness. The engines would be cold-soaked overnight, not just the Sherman's Continental R975 radial, but also a Maybach from a Panther and a Ford GAA Vi-8 stored for comparison. The hangar temperature dropped to minus 18 degrees Celsius. Frost formed on bolts, hoses stiffened, oil thickened into a sluggish syrup. The men recorded each reading with precision, convinced that morning would bring predictable results. Outside, the world was quiet except for the whisper of falling snow. Inside, tools clinked, boots scraped, and the rhythmic ticking of cooling metal echoed through the hall. By midnight, even the Panther's Maybach had fallen silent, its breath frozen in its cylinders. The Sherman, too, stood lifeless, its engine bay like a tomb. The men believed the night would prove their superiority once again. Dawn arrived in a dull gray light that filled the hangar with a ghostly glow. The cold was absolute, the kind that seeped through gloves and uniforms, numbing hands and thought alike. Frost glistened on the Sherman's hull, and thin streams of vapor curled from the seams of the steel doors. One by one, the engineers gathered their instruments and prepared to record the moment of truth. The first crank of the German Maybach was heavy and reluctant. Its starter groaned, caught for a second, then stopped dead. The second attempt ended in silence. A third try yielded nothing but the soft hiss of electrical failure. The mechanics exchanged glances but said nothing. The cold had choked their prize machine. Attention shifted to the Sherman. Its Continental radial engine, built for aircraft and adapted for tanks, was primitive in design, but simple and robust. The air smelled faintly of old gasoline as they primed the lines. The moment stretched, the sound of the switch breaking the stillness. The engine turned once, then twice, a deep metallic pulse echoing through the hangar. On the third rotation, it caught, first with a sputter, then with a steady, confident rhythm. A column of pale exhaust rose into the freezing air, twisting in the half-light. Frost melted from the edges of its vents. The vibrations ran through the floor like a heartbeat. There was no laughter now. The men who had once smirked at its crude design stared in silence. The American machine, built for production lines and driven by simplicity, had done what their precision-crafted Maybach could not. It had lived through the night, awakened in the cold, and run as though nothing had changed. The snow outside fell heavier, muting the sound of the idling engine. The hangar filled with mist and the soft glow of exhaust vapor. Notes were taken in hurried strokes. The air was thick with realization. The Sherman's engine, designed for universality rather than perfection, had proven itself where refinement failed. In that frozen dawn, surrounded by silence and frost, the truth was clear. The Americans had not built beauty, they had built survival. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the proving ground under a sky the color of dull steel. The Sherman sat at the center of the test yard, its olive paint half hidden under frost, its engine humming steadily in defiance of the cold. The German engineers stood in a loose circle around it, their breath rising in pale clouds, notebooks open, pencils scratching rapidly. The previous night's confidence had evaporated. What remained now was professional silence, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The morning's results were undeniable. The Panther's Maybach HL-230, despite its complexity and craftsmanship, had failed to start after the overnight freeze. The fuel lines had congealed, the battery had lost charge, and the oil pump refused to turn. The same had happened to a spare Panzer IV engine kept nearby. Yet the American Continental R-975 Radial had come to life with only minimal hesitation. The Germans began to repeat the test methodically. They let the Sherman idle until it was warm, then shut it down completely and left it in the open air once more. The temperature hovered just below freezing, enough to frost the steel again. Hours later, they returned, reconnected their instruments, and cranked it again. The same result. The engine caught instantly. This was not supposed to happen. The radial engine was, by German standards, primitive. A design pulled straight from pre-war aviation. Its cylinders were air-cooled, its layout unconventional, its tolerances wide. It should have been inefficient, unreliable, and unsophisticated. But it worked. And more than that, it worked every time. Some of the engineers took new measurements. They recorded oil pressure recovery time, crankshaft resistance, combustion temperature, and startup amperage. Each value showed the same pattern: consistency. The Sherman's engine had none of the elegance of the Maybach, none of its intricate engineering, yet it shrugged off conditions that would have paralyzed German machinery. By midday, the experiment expanded. A second Sherman engine, a 4G AAV-8, recently captured from another vehicle, was brought out from its crate. The same preparation followed: drained, chilled, refilled, and left to freeze. When the time came to test it, the pattern repeated. A rough initial cough, then a smooth, confident rumble. Another success. The engineers began to understand the difference. German engines were built for precision, performance, and speed, machines meant to operate under ideal conditions. The American designs were made for everything else: mud, dust, cold, neglect, and haste. They were simple to repair, easy to maintain, and forgiving in the hands of untrained mechanics. Where the Germans prized perfection, the Americans had built resilience. Outside the hangar, the air was silent, except for the steady hum of the Sherman's engine. Its exhaust formed thick white plumes that drifted across the snow like ghosts of victory. The Germans watched, their expressions unreadable. The sound was not loud, but it carried a steady, unshakable rhythm that seemed to mock their failure. In the afternoon, they repeated the process one last time, lowering the temperature further using chilled air from storage units. The mercury dropped toward minus 25 degrees Celsius. When they tried the Maybach again, it barely turned. The oil, even preheated, refused to circulate. The Sherman's engine, meanwhile, roared to life with the same blunt confidence as before, shaking the frost from its vents. No one spoke. The lesson was written across the frost-bitten ground, louder than any argument could be. The Americans had designed not for brilliance, but for war, for conditions where nothing was easy, where survival mattered more than precision. As night approached, the Sherman was left idling in the cold, its rhythmic growl echoing across the frozen testing field. The German engineers, their notes complete, turned away slowly, each one carrying the same thought that none dared to voice aloud. In the silence that followed, the machine continued to run. Its heartbeat echoed through the snow, steady and alive, a quiet testament to the truth they had not wanted to believe. The second night at Kummersdorf was colder than the first. A sharp wind swept across the proving ground, carrying with it tiny shards of ice that stung the skin and coated every surface in a thin white film. The engineers had left the Sherman outside deliberately, its engine exposed to the full force of the temperature drop. The goal was simple: prove that the morning's success had been a fluke. Machines, they believed, should obey limits. By dawn, the cold had reached minus 30 degrees Celsius. The Panther's Maybach engine sat motionless in the adjacent test stand, its metal contracting with soft groans. Its polished pistons, the pride of German engineering, were frozen solid. Yet when they reached the Sherman, the scene was eerily familiar. The American machine stood quietly under a mound of snow, unbothered. When the time came, they brushed off the drifts and connected the gauges again. The mechanic pulled the switch. The engine turned once, twice, then came the same low, confident roar, rolling through the yard like a defiance of nature itself. The frost melted from the grill as the radio warmed. Oil pressure held, the revolution smoothed, and the Sherman's exhaust formed its familiar white plume. The data sheets began to fill with numbers that made no sense. Cold start ignition delay, minimal. Oil pressure stabilization, normal. Power output, unchanged. The engineers recalibrated their instruments twice, convinced of error. But the figures repeated perfectly. They began to suspect the truth. The Sherman's radial engine, crude by their standards, had an advantage that their Maybachs did not: tolerance. Its components were not machined to near microscopic precision, but designed to operate with clearance, to flex and expand without seizing. Where German engines froze from perfection, the American ones survived through forgiveness. The air-cooled cylinders were another revelation. They required no liquid coolant to freeze, no vulnerable radiators, no delicate pumps. The same simplicity that German engineers had mocked now appeared brilliant in its practicality. Later that day, the Ford GAA was tested again. Its massive V8, built from aluminum, turned over instantly. It lacked the elegance of a Maybach or the artistry of a Daimler-Benz. Yet it responded like a machine that did not care about climate or country. The Germans noted the efficiency of its electric starter and the durability of its wiring. Even these details felt almost insulting in their reliability. The mood inside the hangar shifted from superiority to unease. The men who had come to laugh now took measurements with quiet respect. Every result contradicted their expectations. They compared schematics side by side. Maybach HL230 versus Continental R975. One represented perfection under control, the other, imperfection built for chaos. Outside, the sound of the Sherman running became a constant backdrop, a mechanical heartbeat that refused to die. The engineers, standing in their heavy coats, listened to it through the cold. There was something unsettling about the steadiness of it. It was not just the sound of an engine, but the sound of industry, of scale, of a machine that had been built not as a prototype, but as a product of millions. They began to realize what that meant. The Americans could lose engines like this by the hundreds and replace them in days. Germany, meanwhile, produced precision machines so delicate and rare that every failure mattered. The math was brutal. 1,000 Shermans meant 1,000 chances to adapt. A single broken Panther was a disaster. By nightfall, the Sherman's engine was still running. Its temperature gauges held steady, its fuel consumption consistent. The frost melted in a widening circle around its tracks. The men stood there for a long time, their breath hanging in the air. Some still could not accept it. Others already knew what it meant. The enemy's strength was not brilliance. It was endurance, repetition, and design made for war's reality, not its ideal. As the light faded, the hangar doors creaked shut. The last sound before darkness was the steady hum of the Sherman's motor, alive in a cold that had killed everything else. The third morning dawned in silence, broken only by the faint hum of the surviving generator in the corner of the hangar. Outside, the world was buried under new snow, the drifts deep enough to swallow the lower treads of the vehicles. The air was colder still, sharp enough to burn the lungs. For the German engineers, the results of the previous tests were impossible to ignore. The Sherman's engine had started and run flawlessly for 48 hours in conditions that had crippled their own machines. But now they wanted proof under stress, endurance, not just ignition. If the American engine could survive a full operational cycle in these temperatures, it would overturn everything they believed about tank design. The Sherman was rolled out again, its tracks crunching over ice that cracked like glass. Its metal glowed faintly under the pale morning sun. The Germans had set up a test course across the field, a series of low hills, shallow pits, and snow ridges meant to simulate field conditions. The plan was to run the tank continuously for several hours, then leave it idle overnight once more, before another cold start. The Maybach engines were tested first. 2 were mounted in stationary rigs for comparison. One managed to turn over briefly before seizing. The second failed entirely. The Panther's own cold weather modifications had proved useless. The air filters clogged with frost, the lubricants thickened again, and the combustion chamber refused to maintain compression. Precision had once again turned to fragility. Then came the Sherman. Its engine had been shut down for half the night, its oil left unheated, its fuel unprimed. When the switch was thrown, the starter spun once. Then the radial engine roared to life, as if the cold were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. The exhaust burst out in white clouds that quickly filled the air. The tank moved forward, its treads biting through the frozen snow with surprising ease. The engine maintained steady power, its rhythm unchanged by the temperature. The Germans recorded every metric: revolutions, oil pressure, exhaust temperature, and torque. Each one fell within normal range. As the test continued, the Sherman climbed a ridge, slick with ice, descended into a frozen pit, and pulled itself free without stalling. The noise echoed across the proving grounds, a steady, confident rumble. The Germans, who had seen their own machines fail under far less strain, could only watch. The Sherman was not beautiful, but it was unbreakable. By midday, frost had begun to build on the engineers' instruments. The men stamped their feet, breath heavy, faces pale. Yet the tank kept moving, circling the field as if it had forgotten the cold entirely. Hours passed. When it was finally shut down, the snow had melted around its hull from the heat alone. They left it out there overnight again. The next morning, the pattern repeated. The temperature dropped even lower. The fuel stiffened in the lines, but the Sherman's radial still started. Not instantly this time, but certainly. Its pistons turned with confidence, the cylinders catching one after another until the familiar growl filled the air. By then, the laughter was gone. The engineers were quiet, thoughtful. They understood what they were seeing. Not a miracle, not luck, but engineering born of practicality. The Americans had designed for the world as it was, not as it ought to be. Their machines were made to work in the hands of exhausted men in mud, dust, and cold. Conditions where German machines, for all their precision, could not endure. That night the Germans gathered in the briefing hut, a dim room filled with maps, schematics, and cigarette smoke. On the wall hung a chart of comparative performance. Panther HL 230, Panzer YV Maybach, Sherman R 975. The numbers were written in black ink, cold and factual. One column stood out: reliability. The American engine had scored nearly perfect. Outside, through the frost-covered window, the Sherman still sat idling in the dark, its exhaust rising into the frozen air. It looked less like a machine now, and more like a symbol, not of power, but of persistence. It had survived every test they could devise. It had endured the cold, the time, and their disbelief, and it would keep running long after they stopped. By the fifth day of testing, even the most skeptical engineers had stopped pretending the Sherman's success was coincidence. The experiment had become something larger than they intended, a quiet confrontation between two philosophies of war. German engineering worshiped precision, tolerances measured in microns, mechanisms tuned like instruments. American engineering was blunt, functional, forgiving. One built machines to perform perfectly, the other built machines to survive. The field at Kummersdorf had turned into a graveyard of comparison. The Maybachs sat silent, their casings frost-bitten, the metal cracked where the cold had bitten too deep. Nearby, the American engines still throbbed with life. The Sherman idled at the far end of the yard, its engine running as steadily as on the first day. For this day's test, the engineers decided on endurance under simulated combat stress. The Sherman would be driven continuously for hours with the temperature kept below freezing and then left in the open overnight once again. If it could start after that, after a full mechanical load in the deep chill of night, then even the most patriotic engineer would have to admit what they had refused to believe. The tank was fueled and checked over one last time. Its radial engine spun easily, the deep hum rolling through the hangar. It began its run just after sunrise, moving over uneven snow, then onto packed earth, and finally through a mix of ice and mud that had formed during the brief midday thaw. The Germans followed in a half-track, notebooks open, instruments rattling. For hour after hour, the Sherman ran without pause. Its air-cooled cylinders held temperature within limits, its fuel consumption steady. Not once did the oil pressure drop, not once did the engine falter. The exhaust note was unwavering. the mechanical equivalent of confidence. By afternoon, the Panther's test engine was tried once more for comparison. It refused to turn. The coolant in its system had frozen solid, cracking the pipes and freezing the pump in place. The contrast was merciless. One machine was a sculpture of engineering perfection, turned corpse by cold. The other was a living, breathing thing that refused to die. As evening fell, the temperature dropped again. The Sherman was parked on open ground, left deliberately exposed to the frost and wind. The engineers packed up for the night, leaving only one man on watch. The tank sat there like a creature at rest, steam rising from its cooling vents. By morning, the snow had covered it completely. The thermometer read minus 33 degrees Celsius. The metal groaned as the engineers approached, the sound of cold contracting through the hull. They connected their instruments one final time. The battery, half drained, still held charge. The man at the controls pressed the starter. The engine turned sluggishly once, twice, and then roared to life. It was slower this time. The oil thick, the cylinders frozen. But it started. The exhaust burst in white clouds that rolled across the yard. The gauges climbed, the rhythm steadied. The German said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Every doubt had been burned away by that sound. That steady, defiant hum that belonged to no miracle, only to engineering that understood reality better than pride. In the following days, reports were typed and filed. The results were undeniable. The captured American engines had outperformed their German counterparts in cold start reliability, endurance, and resistance to environmental damage. The words were clinical, stripped of emotion, but between the lines was something heavier: acknowledgement. The engineers began to see what their frontline soldiers already knew. The American tanks, for all their simplicity, worked. They moved when they needed to, started when they shouldn't have, and endured what should have killed them. They were not built to impress. They were built to win. That evening, the last of the reports was signed, stamped, and filed. The hangar lights dimmed, and the men left in silence. Outside, the Sherman sat under the returning snow, its engine ticking as it cooled. It had nothing left to prove. The sixth day brought a new kind of cold, the kind that cracked concrete and froze breath before it hit the air. The Kummersdorf proving ground was still, blanketed in white silence. The Sherman stood at the edge of the field, a dark, defiant shape half buried in frost. Inside the hangar, the German engineers gathered around the test results spread across a steel table. The figures were stark, stripped of opinion. Cold start reliability, fuel stability, mechanical endurance. All marked exceeded expectations. But to the men reading them, the numbers felt like an accusation. For years, German industry had built its tanks as masterpieces. The Tiger, the Panther, each a triumph of precision and power. Yet those machines had proven vulnerable in ways no engineer had predicted. They froze, they stalled, they failed to restart when the front demanded movement most. The Sherman, by contrast, was a contradiction. It was noisy, simple, even ugly by their standards. But it lived when everything else stopped breathing. On that morning, the engineers decided to push beyond comparison. They wanted to understand why. Every component of the Sherman's Continental R-975 radial was dismantled and laid out on benches under the cold light. The air was filled with the sound of tools and the faint hiss of breath through masks. The Germans moved slowly, methodically, noting the differences. They found nothing elegant. The bearings were wider than expected, the tolerances looser, the fittings basic. Everything about the engine screamed utility. No wasted detail, no obsession with polish. Each part was designed to fit easily, even roughly, to be replaced by an untrained mechanic with basic tools. It was an engine that anticipated failure and forgave it. The engineers examined the air cooling system next. They had mocked it before. No liquid coolant, no fine radiators, no clever thermal regulators. But here, simplicity had become brilliance. In the Russian winter, where radiators froze solid and coolant turned to slush, the air-cooled radial had no such weakness. It breathed freely in conditions that killed everything else. By midday, the disassembled parts were laid out, like an anatomy lesson in humility. The men took notes in silence. Every gear, every bolt told the same story. This engine was not made for engineers. It was made for soldiers. It did not require perfection, only persistence. That afternoon, a replacement engine was unpacked. A Ford GAA V8. Sleeker than the Radial, built from aluminum, water-cooled, and designed for mass production. The Germans examined it closely. Once again, simplicity reigned. The wiring harness was straightforward, the fuel system direct, the starter motor robust and accessible. It was a design built not for glory, but for the grim arithmetic of war. Fast to build, fast to fix, and impossible to kill. They installed it into the Sherman hull and prepared for another round of cold start tests. Outside, the wind howled across the snow, a low and endless sound. The sky was the color of lead. When they hit the starter switch, the Ford engine came alive immediately, a deep, rolling growl that echoed across the field. The Germans stepped back. The sound was lower, heavier than the Radial's pulse, but just as steady. The new data matched the old. Perfect ignition, consistent idle, seamless recovery under load. It was another machine that refused to fail. By dusk, the engineers had stopped writing. They simply watched, the air filled with exhaust vapor, twisting into the frozen sky. The noise of the running engines, two different American hearts beating in unison, carried over the snow like a message. The message was unmistakable. This was what true industrial power looked like. Not perfection, but endurance. Not artistry, but reliability. The German engineers, men of brilliance and pride, finally understood what their nation had miscalculated. In war, it wasn't the perfect machine that triumphed. It was the one that kept moving when everything else broke. The snow began to fall again, heavy and slow. The engines ran on into the dark, their steady rhythm fading into the storm. By the seventh day, Kummersdorf had become a landscape of contradictions. Frozen silence broken by the constant hum of American machinery. The Sherman's engine, running for days with only minimal maintenance, had become something almost supernatural in its reliability. It had survived deep cold, constant operation, and neglect. Its rhythm had become the metronome of humiliation for those who once laughed at it. Inside the observation room, the German engineers reviewed their findings again. Charts and blueprints covered the walls. Oil-stained gloves hung near the heater, which barely kept the air above freezing. The lead engineer, once so certain of German superiority, now stared at a page filled with data that defied everything he'd been taught. The American design philosophy, mass production, simplification, and rugged functionality, had produced not mediocrity, but a kind of industrial genius. The Sherman's heart, the R975 Radial, had proven more resilient than any Maybach or Daimler engine under extreme conditions. Its air-cooled construction, dismissed by the Germans as primitive, had proven nearly immune to freezing. Even after days of cold starts, its cylinders showed little wear. It had survived what their precision-built Maybachs could not. But it wasn't just the engine. The engineers began to analyze the entire powertrain. The transmission, though less refined, shifted smoothly even after long exposure to cold. The electrical systems, designed for quick replacement and simplicity, performed flawlessly. Nothing on the vehicle demanded the expertise of a specialist. Everything was built for a soldier, for a mechanic in a muddy field, for war as it truly was. That realization cut deep. The Germans had built tanks for engineers, masterpieces that required careful handling, maintenance, and attention. The Americans had built tanks for war. The afternoon's test was meant to confirm operational endurance. The Sherman would be run continuously through simulated combat movement for 24 hours, its engine never allowed to cool. Fuel would be replenished without shutdown. The temperature outside remained at -28 degrees Celsius, and the snow whipped across the field like smoke. When the trial began, the sound of the Sherman filled the proving grounds. It drove through snow, over packed ice, around obstacles. Hour after hour, it maintained power. The Radial's pulse deepened but never faltered. Every few hours, the engineers checked oil levels, pressure, and temperature, all within expected limits. The machine simply kept running. Meanwhile, a Panther was towed onto the field for comparison. Its engine was heated artificially, coaxed into operation by forced air and chemical warmers. Even then, its start was sluggish, its idle uneven. Within an hour, it sputtered and died again. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The might of German design undone by its own delicacy. The test continued long into the night. Frost gathered on the Sherman's hull, melted by heat from within, and froze again in layers. Its exhaust carved a column through the falling snow, glowing faintly in the dim light. The engineers watched from their shelter, hands buried in pockets, faces blank. They no longer mocked the crude American tank. They respected it, feared it even. When dawn came, the Sherman was still running, its fuel almost gone, its engine still steady. The instruments showed no sign of critical wear. The test log was complete. The data was overwhelming. The engineers shut it down at last. The field fell silent, but in that silence was something more than quiet. It was the sound of realization. They had built machines of elegance, of artistry, but across the ocean, their enemy had built machines of endurance, ones that could be replaced, repaired, and sent back to battle in hours. The war, they now understood, would be decided not by perfection, but by production, not by the rare, but by the reliable. In the distance, the frozen forest creaked under the wind. The Sherman sat motionless, its engine cooling slowly, still intact, still ready. It had done what it always did. It had survived. The eighth day dawned beneath a sky as white as bone. The wind no longer howled. It whispered, faint and cold, over the frozen proving grounds of Kummersdorf. The Sherman stood where it had been left, a dark shadow beneath a crust of snow and ice, its presence almost defiant. The German engineers arrived early, the crunch of their boots the only sound in the endless stillness. Their faces were drawn, tired, yet something in their expressions had changed. The laughter was gone. What remained was respect, sharpened by the quiet sting of realization. They began that day's work not as skeptics but as students. Every part of the Sherman's performance was recorded, timed, and analyzed. The Continental Radial had endured conditions that had broken their own machines. The Ford V8 had started instantly in the cold, its pistons firing in perfect rhythm. The data spoke with the calm authority of truth. Now their focus shifted to logistics. The Americans, they noted, built these engines not for the laboratory, but for the assembly line. Each one was stamped, numbered, and standardized. Identical parts that could be swapped between tanks with minimal adjustment. The Germans had no equivalent. Each of their engines, each transmission, each component was effectively custom-built. What took the Americans hours to fix took Germany days. On the testing table, the disassembled parts told the story more clearly than any report. The American metals were not exotic. Their machining was not delicate. Yet every piece fit perfectly, as though shaped by repetition rather than art. The engineers realized that what the Americans lacked in refinement, they compensated for with something far more powerful: consistency. They had underestimated what industrial power truly meant. Outside, the test continued. The Sherman's engine was restarted yet again after another night of deep cold. It turned over easily, catching on the first try. The engineers watched the gauges rise: oil pressure, temperature, revolutions, each one climbing steadily to its optimal mark. There was no drama, no struggle, no hesitation, just function. When the vehicle began to move, snow crunched under its treads. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic. It maneuvered through obstacles, turned smoothly, and stopped on command. It seemed immune to failure, as though the cold and time themselves could not touch it. The Germans compared this to their own experiences on the Eastern Front. Reports had already circulated. Tanks immobilized by frost, engines cracking open overnight, convoys stalled for days. Every battalion had a story of a Tiger or Panther abandoned not because it was destroyed, but because it had simply refused to start. Yet this enemy machine, built by men they once dismissed as amateurs, would not stop running. In that moment, the Sherman became more than an engine test. It became a lesson in the future of warfare. The Germans were realizing that victory did not belong to the nation with the most advanced designs, but to the one that could build the most, the one that could sustain, adapt, and endure. Inside the hangar, the lead engineer closed his notebook. The pages were filled with figures, annotations, and quiet admissions. He knew what they had discovered here would not stay secret for long. The Allies were not just outnumbering them, they were outlasting them. As the day faded, the Sherman was parked one final time outside the hangar. The snow fell again, soft and heavy, muffling the world in silence. The machine stood still, steam rising faintly from its engine vents, heat defying the air around it. The men turned away, leaving the proving ground behind. The sound of their boots disappeared into the snow, but the faint ticking of the cooling engine followed them, a heartbeat fading into the winter. It was a sound they would not forget. It was the sound of endurance, the kind that outlives pride, outlasts perfection, and wins wars. The ninth day began beneath a sky bruised with clouds, the air heavy with the promise of another storm. Kummersdorf was silent except for the faint groan of wind moving through the skeletons of frozen vehicles. The Sherman still stood in the center of the proving ground, its olive paint buried beneath a crust of frost. It had become something more than an experiment now, a symbol, an uninvited teacher in a place built for certainty. The engineers gathered once more, not to mock or to compete, but to understand. They had accepted what the numbers told them, but now they wanted to know why the Americans had chosen to build this way, why they had abandoned precision for simplicity, elegance for repetition. To the Germans, engineering was an art. To the Americans, it seemed to be a tool. And yet that very philosophy was reshaping the war. They reviewed captured reports, production data, and intelligence summaries. Across the Atlantic, factories the size of cities were producing tanks, engines, and spare parts faster than the Germans could count. Each engine that rolled off the line was nearly identical to the one before it. The Americans had discovered something the Germans had not, that uniformity was power. It allowed their machines to be fixed anywhere, by anyone, under any condition. The Sherman's success in the cold was a small piece of a much larger truth. It was not the brilliance of a single design that made it formidable, but the sheer scale and practicality of its creation. For every one German tank that failed in the snow, 10 Shermans could roll forward, their engines ready, their crews warm inside. That morning, another test was ordered, not by command, but out of curiosity. The Sherman would be run once more after being completely drained of fluids and refilled under freezing conditions, mimicking the worst maintenance scenario possible. The Germans wanted to see how much abuse it could truly take. The process was brutal. Fuel was frozen into slush before being added. The oil had the texture of syrup. The air was cold enough to numb fingers through gloves. When the procedure was finished, they stood back, certain that this time, at last, the machine would fail. The ignition switch was pressed. The starter whined once, hesitated, then impossibly the radial coughed and caught. The roar filled the air again, deep and steady. Steam burst from the vents, and the smell of warm fuel filled the hangar. The engine had survived yet another test of endurance. The men stood motionless, their breath fogging in front of them. No words were spoken. The sound of the running engine said everything. It was not the loudest or most powerful engine they had ever heard, but it was, without question, the most alive. Later, when the reports were written, the results were summarized in one line. The American power plant demonstrates operational reliability under all observed conditions. But that simple sentence did not capture the full weight of what they had witnessed. They had seen a philosophy in motion, an approach to war and industry that defied their own understanding. The Sherman was not perfect, but it did not need to be. It simply worked. And in war, that was everything. By dusk, the storm finally broke. Snow swept across the field in long, drifting waves. The engineers left one by one, their notebooks filled with reluctant admiration. The Sherman was left idling in the snow, its exhaust glowing faintly in the dark. From a distance, its steady hum blended with the wind, a sound less like a machine and more like a quiet promise. It was the sound of endurance made mechanical, the sound of a war being won not by brilliance, but by persistence. And somewhere deep inside that frozen machine, the engine kept breathing, steady, rhythmic, alive against the cold. The 10th morning dawned gray and lifeless over Kummersdorf. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the landscape washed in white silence. The Sherman sat motionless at the edge of the field, its metal glinting faintly beneath the frost, the shape of its hull softened by ice and wind. Around it, the traces of the previous days, footprints, tool marks, oil stains, had been buried by the storm. Only the tank remained, an unshaken monument to persistence. The German engineers arrived quietly, their breath steaming in the air, their boots crunching against the snow. They no longer approached the Sherman as critics, but as witnesses. For more than a week, they had tested, disassembled, and studied it. They had exposed it to the kind of cold that broke their own machines apart. And still it lived. The last test was simple. One final start after 10 days in the unrelenting winter. No warmers, no adjustments, no excuses. The switch was pressed. The starter turned. And once again, the radial engine came to life. Slow at first, then steady, then strong. Its sound filled the hangar with the same calm defiance it had carried since the first morning. Steam rose from the vents, curling through the cold air in smooth white plumes. The gauges climbed. Every system responded as if it had been built for this moment, as if it had been waiting for it. No one moved for several seconds. The men simply stood, watching the exhaust drift upward into the rafters. They had learned everything they could from this machine, and yet the lessons still felt impossible to fully accept. The Americans had done what Germany, with all its precision, had failed to do. They had built a tank engine that worked anywhere, under any condition, with no regard for pride or complexity. The reports were finished that afternoon, each one written in careful, technical language, stripped of emotion but heavy with implication. The Sherman's Continental Radial and 4GRA were both marked as superior under low-temperature conditions. The German engines, by contrast, were described as mechanically refined but unsuitable for sustained cold-weather operations. It was a polite way of saying that perfection had failed. When the final entry was complete, the lead engineer closed the file and rested his hand on the table. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of cooling metal from the Sherman outside. He knew these findings would travel upward through the ranks, that somewhere in Berlin someone would read them and understand that the war was shifting not because of brilliance, but because of endurance. Outside, the wind picked up again. Snow drifted across the open ground. The Sherman sat in the middle of it all, idling gently, its exhaust trailing into the sky like a heartbeat against the cold. The Germans had come to prove its weakness. Instead, they had uncovered their own. For all their superiority in design, for all their mastery of steel and precision, they had overlooked the most powerful truth of all. War rewards not the perfect machine, but the one that refuses to stop running. The Sherman's engine continued to hum, steady as ever, a sound that belonged not to genius, but to endurance, to the unglamorous brilliance of reliability. And though the German engineers eventually left, their breath fading into the snow, that sound lingered behind them, echoing through the frozen field. It was the sound of an idea too simple to fail, the sound of industry built for victory, the sound of the machine that would not die. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.